Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. It's possible to question just about everything. There's only one thing that we can be completely sure of immediately and a priori without any possibility for doubt, and that's consciousness. It's possible to doubt the existence of the outside world. It's possible to doubt the veracity of our sense impressions. But there's really no way you can possibly deny that you are conscious. There is an experience, a knowing. This knowing is the most immediate and intimate activity to our being. It's the very essence of our being as conscious entities, as sentient beings, that we have this faculty of knowing. And yet it remains mysterious. It's the commonest, most universal, but also probably the least understood phenomena. To begin with, we need to be clear about our use of language and terms, and what are we talking about? In Pali, we have the word chitta that's found primarily in Abhidhamma, but it's also found in the suttas occasionally. In the suttas, more commonly, the word used is vijnana. And in English, we have the word consciousness. And part of the problem of understanding it, one of the beginning problems, is the use of language. As very often we find with Buddhist concepts that the English is fuzzy. It is not as clearly defined as the Pali terms. So the word consciousness is used in English by different sources, by different writers and thinkers in different ways, which leads to confusion. In some cases, consciousness is used in English to refer to mental processing. In some cases, it's narrowed to a special application of self-consciousness. I've seen an example of this in a book of essays about consciousness from various secular sources, from various philosophers and scientists. The theme of the book was, "What is consciousness?" And it was obvious reading through the essays that there was no agreement on the general meaning of the term. One of the essays tried to describe consciousness as a kind of, to use the writer's words, a black box phenomena, that you have an input and you have an output, and what's going on in between is sort of unknown, so we call that consciousness. And this author was forced to admit the weakness of his own definition when he said that, admittedly, by this definition, something like an automatic door opener could be considered conscious. Another of the writers leaned on this idea of self-consciousness, that consciousness of itself as an entity, and then his definition would limit consciousness, he said, to, on this planet, to human beings and maybe the great apes. Well, so some writers or thinkers will use the word consciousness more precisely in the Buddhist sense. So what is that? What does chitta mean? The simple process or act of knowing, and knowing in the sense of having an experience. And we're doing that, of course, every moment, immediately. Consciousness never ceases its activity. There is a presence, a knowing. There's something at the end of the chain of processing that knows. Now, you can have computer software connected to a camera that can recognize faces, facial recognition software. But the computer has no experience. It's just inputting and outputting data. But the operator sitting at the desk with the computer running that, she has an experience. There's something it means to see and to know. Another problem that we have in understanding consciousness is, again, related to language, is that it's an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of human language and speech. In whatever language we use, we are forced to use nouns to refer to consciousness or mind or chitta. We use a noun, and that sets up an implicit bias in the listener or the reader that we are talking about something. So there's an essentialist or substantialist bias set up in trying to understand consciousness as some kind of persistent or substantial thing or entity. You can see a subtle version of this, I think, in René Descartes' famous Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which is often said to be the foundation stone of modern thought. And Descartes thought he was starting from indisputable first principles. This, I think, therefore I am. There's already in that first term, I think, there's already an assumption built in that I am thinking. And even there is also a confusion of thinking with pure consciousness, which doesn't require thought. And it certainly doesn't require an I. There's just a knowing. In our ordinary existence, consciousness is always taking objects. And there's a whole processing involved when we take an object. And we easily, naively mistake the subject and the object. It's like consciousness gets lost or entrapped or entangled in the processes of mind. When we take an object, there's feeling arises, there's perception, there's cognition. And all these things are not done by chitta, but they're known by chitta. Most of the rest of what we do with the mind, all the rest of the processing, at least a very great deal of it, can be replicated in computer software. The example of facial recognition replicates perception and cognition. But there's no possible way of replicating consciousness. And this points to another reason why consciousness eludes understanding, is because to understand something, we want to make it complicated. We want to be able to explain it in terms of a process. But consciousness doesn't reduce. Consciousness just is as it is. It's difficult to grasp, not because it's too complicated, but because it's so utterly simple. There's nothing there to grasp or to compare it with or to explain it by. A more precise way of stating this is that consciousness is non-algorithmic. Any process that is able to be replicated can be reduced to an algorithm, meaning a defined set of steps, a procedure. But consciousness doesn't have any steps or procedures. There's no algorithm that could explain consciousness. It's the simple knowing. So in Abhidhamma, citta is considered as a momentary phenomena, because in any moment it's taking an object, and you can define the consciousness of that moment by its object. And in the next moment there's a different object. The objects, the dhammas, objects of consciousness. In the language of the suttas, the Buddha phrases it in terms of vijnana, from the verb vijanati, which is again a kind of knowing. And the concept of vijnana is used in a couple of different contexts. It's used in terms of the 5 aggregates. Vijnana is one of the aggregates. And it's also used in the dependent origination. It's the 3rd term of the dependent origination. And in both of these cases, it has a very specialized technical meaning. In terms of the aggregates, vijnana is consciousness or citta arising through the 6 sense doors. There's eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness, which just means it's taking mental objects, like imaginary objects in the mind. But it's defined by the door and by the object. Each door takes a specialized class of objects. So this is citta in operative mode. This is in working mode, how it functions in a human form. And again, I caution, although I'm forced to use language that makes it sound like there's an it, there isn't any it there. It's a verb, really, not a noun. It's just a knowing. In terms of dependent origination, it's very precisely defined as being patisandhi vijnana, which is the rebirth linking consciousness. So it's in terms of the beginning of a new life continuum. Consciousness arises, conditioned by past karmas. But we could say citta is a more general term. It's the nature of consciousness per se. Whereas in an ordinary human existence, we're tangled up with the processing. So we don't understand what's going on. So you tend to identify with the objects. And we tend to create a self that's doing it. Also in Abhidhamma, there's classifications of citta according to various criteria, one of which is by plane or bhumi. The human existence is part of the kama bhumi, which is the sense desire or sense impression, sense experience realm. And it's the most complex, so it's the most entangled. So consciousness here is constantly getting lost. If we don't center ourselves in the knowing, then we're lost in the objects. Each higher bhumi simplifies consciousness and allows it to operate in a more pristine and primordial kind of state, a more natural state, less cluttered, less confused. The plane of form, which is the jhanas, and the plane of the formless, which is consciousness operating without any reference to matter or the body. And lastly, nibbana, or the unconditioned, the liberated mind, of which there's little can be said because it's beyond the qualities of thought and speech altogether. There is this passage that we discussed a couple of weeks ago when I gave a talk about bhakha. There's a formula that occurs, I think, only twice in the canon, describing the nature of the awakened or liberated mind as being luminous, pabhasara, luminous, boundless, with no footing to find. The liberated mind finds no footing. It's a very literal translation, which means it has no basis, it has no dependency. It's not entangled in anything. It's boundless. There's no limit to it. And it's luminous. It's a powerful metaphor of light as consciousness that occurs also in the Anguttara Nikaya when it's a simple statement, this citta is luminous. So I've highlighted some issues in understanding citta, and it's an area that, although as I said, it's indisputable, citta is it's the indisputable fact, the indisputable reality, and it should be the most immediate, intimate thing that we have no difficulty in being clear about. Nevertheless, it's an endless source of controversy. And we were discussing, I think, earlier today about the issue that arises with some of the Thai forest tradition speaking like Ajahn Mun of citta outside of the five khandha, and how that is seen as very heterodox by the scholarly side of Theravada, like what I like to call a high church Theravada that bases itself very much on the Abhidhamma and the commentaries, whereas the Thai forest tradition is ultimately a yogic tradition. It's based on the experience, immediate experience. But I think also that this seeming contradiction is not really so. The five khandha are the operative mode of existence. It's the coming into being, the manifestation as this class of being or another. is an animal or a human or a dewa. There's five khandha existence. But chitta is not dependent on that. Chitta manifests through that. The chitta outside the five khandhas, although that particular phraseology may be seen by many as problematic, it really is just another way of phrasing the mind that's boundless, luminous, and has no footing. So a lot of the emphasis in the Thai forest practice is to be present and centered in the chitta, the knowing. Which is, I take it, the core idea of Tibetan Dzogchen as well. Just being present in the knowing. Within the Theravada, there have been these two approaches which are approaching the same goal and having the same results from opposite ends, and both valid approaches. One is the Burmese Vipassana method. Whichever branch or particular sect of Vipassana, whichever technique of Vipassana we're talking about, it's all about being present with the objects as they arise, the Dhammas. Whereas the Thai forest approach is being centered in the knowing. But these are just two ways of doing the same thing, starting from a different starting point. And they can seem very different at first, but as one progresses in the practice, the difference becomes less and less. If you are being methodically aware of the objects, you can't do that without being centered in the knowing. And if you're centered in the knowing, you will be cognizant of the objects. In the words of Mahasi Sayadaw, the great Burmese master, the meditator comes to know there is just the object and mind arising to the object. And this is the fundamental duality and the last dualism to go, subject-object. And the difference between them dissolves as the yogi becomes more and more conscious that both are empty, both are void, and both are without a person or an essence or a substance. There's simply this process going on, mind taking an object. And this pure, clear knowing is, as I've said, it's immediate. It's ultimately simple. Technically, it's non-algorithmic. So it's not created, because that would require some kind of a process. And there's nothing there anyway. It's empty, it's utterly void. Simply the knowing. So that which is not created cannot be destroyed, because there's nothing to be destroyed. And we can see the consciousness stream has its own laws and its own process. Each moment of consciousness conditioned by the previous moment. There's a class of beings in the Buddhist cosmology that are called the unconscious beings, the asaññata deva. Beings that are born into that realm through having practiced a kind of a wrong practice when they were ascetics on earth, with the idea that consciousness is itself the root of the problem, and they would eliminate consciousness. So they're reborn into this realm, and they may last there for hundreds of yojanas without a single consciousness moment. But then when they fall from that realm, because everything is impermanent, and they're reborn elsewhere, the consciousness stream picks up where it left off. There was one bhikkhu who remembered having spent time in that realm, and he said 500 yojanas passed as a single moment. He remembered only dying from a human existence and then being reborn again as a human, with that gap in between being non-existent. And that can be kind of hard to understand, but there's a very close parallel to that many people, humans, have experienced in modern times, is going under full anesthetic. You know, I did that once in my life. I had an operation where I was under full anesthetic. And the experience was the doctor puts the cup on your face to breathe the gas, and he says, count to 10 backwards. And you go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And then you wake up in the recovery room an hour, 2 hours, or whatever later. And no time passed in between for your consciousness stream. It just picked up again. So that's quite different from the experience of sleep or deep sleep. It doesn't matter how deeply you sleep, when you wake up, you have the sense at least of time has passed, because consciousness stream continued even in deep sleep. For a being in the unconscious realm or a person under anesthetic, the consciousness stream is not interrupted. Really, it's just on a different track than the rest of the universe. Different time track. So the real gist of this is that the nature of mind and nature of consciousness is one of the central preoccupations of Buddhism from the very beginning. And all the different Buddhist philosophers and all the different schools and sects, they're all concerned with this question. And to understand the nature of consciousness or mind or citta, you're not going to get very far by trying to make it complicated, by trying to figure it out from the outside. Then you get into these kind of hair-splitting controversies that see Ajahn as being heterodox, for example. But try to understand consciousness within your own being immediately. One way of defining sati, or mindfulness, would be remembering that you are conscious. Remembering that you are consciousness, because we tend to forget that. This is what I mean by being lost in the objects. You externalize your being. You're lost in the objects. The way Ouspensky, one of the followers of Gurdjieff, the way he talked about it, I don't think a Buddhist would exactly phrase it in this way, but he's pointing at something important. He's saying that you should remember at all times, you should remember that you are present. If you're out in the street and there's people around, you're one of those people. You know? And we sort of forget that. We externalize our experience. We identify with the external experience rather than the knowing. We forget that we're present. We forget that we're conscious. And there's a great blessing and a great benefit in being centered in the citta. That's one of the real important things to learn from meditation, is if we can be centered in the citta, then we're not a victim of our mind states. Now, people suffer a lot because of their mind states. Anxiety and despair and longing and remorse. And if you identify with those, then you're going to suffer. But if you see them as objects, empty, without substance, and the citta merely knows them, the citta, the knowing, because it's so simple and pristine, it can't be affected by any of that. It can neither be purified nor defiled. It just is as it is. All it does is know. And it's utterly void. There's nothing for anything to cling to or light upon. There's the Zen story about the two monks talking about the nature of mind. And one says it's a bright mirror set up in a high place that illuminates the 10,000 things, and they are reflected in the face of the mirror. And the other monk says, that's not right. The mind is like a mirror in a high place, and it illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in the face thereby. So, I hope I've given you something to think about, the nature of mind.
Sadhu, 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 anu